Thank you, Helen. This morning's reading is from Matthew 4:18 to 22. At least in the Bibles here, it's entitled, Jesus Calls His First Disciples. As Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw two brothers, Simon, called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will send you out to fish for people." At once they left their nets and followed him. Going on from there, he saw two other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. As has been explained this morning, we're looking through a new series at this beginning of this year, a series on discipleship. And I don't know how often in your normal day-to-day lives you use the word discipleship. I'm sure you can come and correct me afterwards, but I don't feel like it's an everyday word outside of church anyway. It's a particular word and has a particular meaning. So what I thought I'd get us to do just to start things off is, with the people that you're sat nearby, take a couple of minutes and chat about what discipleship or the word disciples means to you. So a couple of minutes, chat with the people around you, see if you can come up with some words or phrases of what disciples or discipleship means to you. Go. Okay, hopefully everyone had a chance to chat with at least one other person about that and come up with something. Is anyone brave enough to shout out a quick summary of what they discussed? Maybe some words? Anything? There's lots of chatting. Here, go on, Linda. To learn from a master and be like him. Yeah, thank you. Anything else? Oh, sorry, I can see. Followers, yeah, brilliant. I heard someone else over. Put him first. Okay, excellent. Yeah. Anyone else got anything? Sorry, I heard something else. They're called. Called, brilliant. Thanks, Leonardo. Yep. Say that a bit again. They're called, they grow, and then they evangelize. They grow and then they evangelize. Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you. That's great. Thank you very much. What I've done there is basically crowdsourced the first part of my sermon. Thank you very much. You've helped me out there massively. If we look at the dictionary definition, it talks about being a pupil of a teacher or a philosopher maybe. Just to be clear, when we're talking about discipleship here in church, we're talking about discipleship being disciples of Jesus. Jesus, the Son of God, who came to earth, as we can remember back to Christmas, all that 2-3 weeks ago, are we at now? We thought about Jesus coming to earth as a baby, and then we can think through of his time on earth that we'll we'll see the beginning of here as he's calling his disciples. And as we look ahead to Easter, where Jesus died on the cross for our sins before coming back to life, we're thinking about being disciples of Jesus and what that means. Making disciples. We are... If you were here last week, Keith used this slide. I've just shamelessly copied it from him. But this is what the elders' priorities for our church. And that's something that we should all take a bit of notice of, because it's going to affect the things that we do here at the church. And there's opportunities to be involved in this in different ways, to be challenged about how we can be part of this. It's not just about the elders standing up the front and doing everything. It's for all of us to be involved. But part of what they want us to have a priority for this year is discipleship, and that's why we're spending the first, 2 months or so of this year working through a course on discipleship and what that means. It's come from a resource called We Are Making Disciples, or from the website wearemakingdisciples.com. And I would encourage everyone at some point in this week to take a bit of time to look at this website. There's lots of great resources on there. There's however you if you like to read things, there's articles, there's podcasts, there's YouTube videos that link up with what we're going to be covering over the next few weeks. And there's a great lot of resources, there's things you can download. If maybe one of your New Year's resolutions was to read the Bible, well, they have a course of 101 Bible readings set into themes and can take you through some of the key parts and encourage you in that way if you want to get into the Bible in a slightly different way. But what I like about this picture is it really shows the process. If all we do over the next 10 weeks is have one person stood up the front who says some interesting things and nothing else comes out of that, we're really not doing discipleship right. It came up in some of the things that people said, is that this is a process we work through together. Discipleship should happen in a church, in maybe groups. They don't have to be always a set-up group, but there's different ways we can go about that. It's about doing this together. And in fact, I thought it was really great that I sort of got you to do a bit of discipleship together this morning, and everyone joined in. Everyone took the time this morning to chat to someone about them. And hopefully you learned a bit of something from the person you sat with, at least had a different type of conversation you might have had with them otherwise. That's part of what discipleship can look like. So we all need to think about how we are being challenged to take part in this, whether we take the time out to read something from the website, whether we're encouraged by some of the things that are said over the next few weeks. Maybe we take the time to deliberately spend more time with other people in the church. One of my most profound, I guess, discipleship moments recently was in a car travelling back with some friends from an evening out, and someone started asking some tough questions about faith. And I was a bit tired, and they sort of, it wasn't what I was needing that time of night. But they put me on the spot and made me some questions I probably should have known the answer to. And it made me go away and think, if I can't answer those questions when someone's just having a conversation, what does that say? That, I think, is one way we can do discipleship. Thank you for the people in the church who take the time to ask questions of each other. Sometimes it's a good challenge to ask someone, how are you going with your faith? What does your faith look like in your life? What's your understanding of these parts of our faith? What does it mean for you to be a Christian? Sometimes it's good. Within a friendship, maybe not just for the first thing you say to someone the first time you met them, but sometimes it's good within the context of the church here as brothers and sisters, we know each other well, that we can ask these questions. Another part of the course is this diagram here. If you can't remember back to your GCSE maths, the way these diagrams are supposed to work is we're supposed to aim for the bits that overlap. I'm not going to give a maths lesson, no one wants that this morning, but the idea is that as part of discipleship, there's a few things going on. And actually, over the coming weeks, we're going to go over some of the things written in the circles in more detail, so I'm not going to cover them today, but it's the point that there's disciplines internal to our lives, and there's activity, which is external, out there, through those doors, out in Slough. And the course is making the point that those two things need to happen. We need to get those two things joined up. There's stuff that we can do, disciplines in terms of praying, reading the Bible, worshipping, meeting together, and then there's things that we need to do out there, meeting the needs of the sick, following Jesus' example to help the lost and the low, helping the poor, sharing our faith with those who desperately need to hear it. So over the coming weeks, that's where we're going with this series. And week by week, there'll be different ways that we can respond. There'll be different things we can get involved in. Maybe there's ways that we can have discussions with each other based on what's happening on a Sunday morning. It's part of a way to actually grow this together, not just coming from one person standing at the front and we all going on with our lives as normal. We have a choice of how we do respond, and we see that with the disciples. Jesus wasn't forcing them to come follow him. He was asking the question, and they responded. And as we were encouraged by Keith last week, and as Helen this morning pointed out, we have this verse to be with us for the year, our memory verse. And Helen got us to fill in the blanks this morning, but actually I think part of it is that we need to understand that it's all our hearts, all our soul. It's quite a challenge, isn't it? Maybe we can think, okay, I could give up a bit. I could spare some time, but we're challenged to live for Jesus, as Keith mentioned quite a few times last week, wholeheartedly. We need to love the Lord our God wholeheartedly. It takes effort, it takes time, it's not easy. We all have lots of other things going on in our lives, but it's something important if we want to grow, if we want to move on in our journey of faith. One last part from the resources on the website. Chris Rogers is the person who put together all these resources. He appears in many of the podcasts and I think some of the videos as well. And he has this quote. He's saying, at its heart, the church has to be disciples making, not just believers making. He's making that distinction that yes, it's both. He's saying not just this, it's both. We need to very clearly be a place where we make believers. That's why we have so many evangelistic events. That's why we open up our church to people who've not heard the gospel before. That's why we welcome people in the building around events for Easter and Christmas. That's very important. But he's making the point that it's not just about that. We should also be making opportunities for people to move on from that initial belief into something that looks more like a disciple. Jesus is looking for people who will give everything of themselves to his mission to change the world. We should be helping people, we should be part of the process, we should be seeing where that makes sense in our life of how we move from believer to disciple, moving along a journey of faith. One of the challenges in the notes that Keith put together for this is saying that the problem, if we just see ourselves as believers, even though we believe in Jesus, that he died on the cross, maybe it means we can be guilty of sitting back, attending church and waiting for the day we get to heaven. Our lives are supposed to be so much more than that. Our lives are supposed to be working for what Jesus wants for our lives in a more dynamic way. Jesus wants us to be his disciples. Yeah, sure, we can't be disciples in exactly the same way as we read in the passage. Jesus is not walking the earth. We're not fishermen giving up our nets in the same way, but what it means for our life is different. Jesus needs people who take his teaching seriously. So I guess part of the challenge as we start this series and as we go on with it is asking ourselves, where are we at with our faith? Do we know and love God first of all? And if we don't, it's something to think about and challenge ourselves. If we hear about Jesus, what does he mean in our lives? But if we do consider ourselves a believer, are we looking to follow Jesus? Are we looking to be our disciple? Do we need to move on from our initial belief into something else? Maybe another way to think about it is this. I'm sure lots of people here have been to concerts. I'm not going to have people shout out all the different types of music they like. My music is very much based on the 90s when I grew up, and my tastes haven't changed too much since then. But anyway, we all have different musical tastes, and I don't know what concerts you might have been to, but over time of history of music, there's always been at one time a band that's the biggest one going, or a singer or whatever. So if you're thinking back to the 60s, at least in this country and maybe elsewhere, it's probably the Beatles. They were the huge band following thousands of screaming fans wherever they went. Nowadays, it might be someone like Taylor Swift. I'm not going to claim any knowledge of her music, but we at least know she shows up in culture even if we don't know any of her songs. There's always bands with lots of fans that follow them around, but fans that are there for the experience maybe. They know all the words of the songs, they're there when a new album is released, listening to it at midnight, they're outside the hotel when the band's staying there. But actually, there's something a bit different. So we have fans, and then we have the idea of followers. And actually, if you think about the analogy of a band, there's very few people who are truly actually following the band around. They might have a small group of people that are their friends when they grew up, maybe they work for them. There's a few people who have a real relationship with that band. Lots of fans follow the music, are there for the event, are there for the experience, probably don't really know the real person. They might know the stage persona, they might know what they see publicly in the press or whatever, but that's a very different relationship. There's only a small amount of people that actually true relationship with the band or with the singer. And it's a nice picture, isn't it? But actually it lines up with what we see with Jesus. It's more significant than just something nowadays. Jesus had lots of people who were essentially there for the experience. There's lots of crowds that came to see Jesus when he was talking. There's lots of people who wanted to see his next miracle. In fact, sometimes he had to stay away from the crowds because there was too many, and we see sometimes when there's so many, he had to feed them or whatever. There's a lot of people coming around with Jesus, but there's only so many that took up his call to follow him in a more deeper way, to follow him with a relationship. And in fact, he was very specific, at least initially, that he only chose 12, the 12 disciples. And just on from the verses we read earlier at the beginning of the next chapter of Matthew, just before Jesus does the Sermon on the Mount, there's these few verses where it says this. This is Matthew 5, verse 1. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them. There and in many other places we see the idea where Jesus is not encouraging all the time the huge crowds. He's taking the time out to be with the disciples, the people he wants to be true followers of him. So however we remember it, whether it's like believer to disciple, whether it's fan to follower, there's different ways to think about it. But the challenge, I guess, for all of us is, are we being asked to move on from one to the other? Are we guilty maybe of spectating when Jesus wants us to be more involved? Are we guilty of fans going on for the experience but not having the real relationship with Jesus? Onto these verses that I read out earlier. If you haven't got them in front of you, or you can see them on the screen, you might want to flick to them. This is just the first two verses of the chapter. We see essentially the same story happening with two sets of fishermen, Andrew and Simon Peter, the brothers, and then the two other brothers, sons of Zebedee, in the second verses. There's a couple of things to remember here. Firstly, that this wasn't necessarily their first meeting with Jesus. They would have experienced him. They would have spent a bit of time, probably heard him talk previously. This isn't something that necessarily came out of the blue for them. They have already had some ideas of who Jesus was. They would have already had a sense of what kind of man he was, what kind of things he was doing, maybe a sense of some of the things he was saying already. We can read back in John 1, 35 to 42, for instance, about Andrew's previous interaction with Jesus. So when Jesus called them, they would have already known who he was. They didn't blindly follow him based on a whim. Yes, sure, there was a sense of faith going on there. They didn't know how things were going to turn out. In fact, Jesus probably deliberately didn't tell them the whole story, because if we know the story of the disciples, things were very, very tough for them as they progressed through their time of being disciples. It was not an easy role they were called into by any stretch of the imagination. But they didn't blindly follow him. But they would have been convinced that following him was a significant and worthwhile thing to do, and something they were prepared to give up their regular life for. But also it's something they chose to do. It wasn't like Jesus spoke to them in such a way that they had no choice. They were sort of in a trance, or they weren't able to respond. They were able to respond how they wanted to. They chose to respond immediately to him. They had a choice. They'd seen Jesus, they'd understood what he was doing, they had a sense of who he was and what kind of person he was, and they wanted to follow. But Jesus gave them the choice. I want you to imagine now, just for a minute, what it would be like for you in that situation. It's maybe a bit hard. I'm sure there's very few people whose job is fishing here. We're in the wrong part of the country, aren't we, really? If we were by the coast, maybe a bit more of a chance, but not round here. What your work situation looks like. Probably not on a boat, although I guess there is some boats on the Thames, but maybe in an office or a factory. Maybe studying at school or college. Or in fact, wherever you're going to be tomorrow morning is a good way of thinking about it. Whatever your situation might be, going about your regular life, doing whatever you're committed to, whatever your role is in life, in family, in friendships, in work, and so on. Imagine where you are tomorrow morning, seeing Jesus, who you've heard a bit about, and he comes over to you. He's walking over, he gets closer to you and simply asks, "Come, follow me." He's saying, "I've got an important job and I want you to be part of it. As he says to the disciples, I will send you out to fish for people. I want you to be involved in my mission. I need you to tell others the good news of how they can be saved. If Jesus stood in front of you and asks, come follow me, how would you respond? Come, follow me. Such a simple question, isn't it? But one can make us feel uncomfortable. I know it does with me, particularly when you realise what the disciples were giving up. If you know, in a sense, how the story ends for them, even if you know from the beginning they're giving up their entire livelihood to follow Jesus, we start to maybe think, maybe our response is, sorry Jesus, I'm a bit busy right now, maybe some other time. Maybe we start to think, this is a bit awkward, I think you've got the wrong person, you probably wanted that person over there. I'm not qualified, I'm not the right person, I don't know how to do what you're asking. Or maybe it's the idea of, I can help you out part of the time, but I can't fully commit. But then we're challenged with this verse, aren't we? All your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and all your strength. Such a simple question, come follow me. Now to be clear, I'm not saying that all of us, come Monday morning, are going to be asked to quit our jobs and move into a completely different role. That's not necessarily the reality, although it has been the reality for some people here. I've been in this church long enough to hear people stood up the front saying they heard something, God spoke to them in a particular way, and they changed the course of their life. Sometimes moving to another country, sometimes moving to a different role. We've heard it from Marshall this morning. He's part of that process now. So that dramatic change can happen in people's lives. But I think it's more about our willingness to live our lives completely committed to Jesus, following his agenda. That could be different for all of us in our lives, what that actually means, what that means day to day. Come, follow me, Jesus said, and I will send you out to fish for people. At once they left their nets and followed him. It's a challenge, isn't it, to read what the disciples did at this point. At once they left their nets. No thinking, no saying, I need to make a few plans, I'll come back to you later. There's a challenge, isn't there? I think sometimes it's easy to put something off and then not get back to it. And sometimes we need to think about the immediate challenge if we feel we're being called to something. They left their nets, their livelihood. Fishing wasn't like a weekend fun time for them to get away from the daily grind. Fishing was their daily grind. This was their life. This is the thing that made them money. This was the thing that let them buy the food they lived off, I guess, except for fish themselves. But they needed the money to live. This is what helped them survive in their lives. This was their daily existence. And they left it to one side to follow Jesus. From that point onwards, they were living their lives based on Jesus' priorities, not their own. But also, to be clear, they were far from the finished article. If we read through the rest of the Gospels, we see many times when the disciples show that they don't quite understand things and Jesus is still teaching them things. I always feel a bit bad for them. Every mistake is written down in four books, sometimes in four different ways, so that we can study it 2,000 years later. Who'd be a disciple when your impetuous response to one of Jesus' questions is kept in a Bible that people read thousands of years later? It was a tough job, but they were far from the finished article. Jesus spent time with them, dedicated time to them, showed them how he wanted them to be, explained to them, revealed things to them over time, bit by bit. They didn't know everything they needed to know at the beginning. They didn't already have all the skills necessary for what Jesus wanted them to do. That's the challenge, I guess. That's the reality of if we want to say that we'll follow Jesus, if we want to say we'll move on to being in a deeper relationship with him, if we want to say that we'll be moving from a believer to a disciple, we might have to change the way we live our lives. We might have to sacrifice our time for things that aren't necessarily our own priorities. I mean, we'll have to learn from Jesus, not just rely on our own knowledge. It's not easy, but it's part of what being a disciple of Jesus means. Moving on from a believer to a disciple, from a fan to a follower, takes effort and may have a cost. So to finish, come follow me, said Jesus. This is a Jesus who died on the cross for us. Jesus, Son of God, who came down to earth so that we could be free from our sins. The good news of Jesus, the gospel, as it's called, is that he did that for us, not because we deserve it, but because he loves us, and by his grace we can be saved. That Jesus is asking us in different ways, in different situations, in different parts of our lives, to come follow him. My prayer is that we can all be changed by responding to Jesus, or by becoming disciples, or by growing into better disciples. I pray we can take the opportunities that will come over the next few months here at Slough Baptist to be part of this process, so that we'll grow as individuals and we'll grow together as a church. Amen.